In the quiet, icy morning of January 20th, 1953, the nation believed it was watching nothing more than a peaceful transition of power, a symbol of American democracy at its finest. But behind those polished shoes, military coats, and smiling photographers lay a secret tension so deep, so personal, and so quietly explosive that historians still whisper about it to this day. Because what unfolded between President Harry S. Truman and General Dwight D. Eisenhower, war hero, Supreme Allied Commander, global icon, was not a polite disagreement or a political rivalry, but a wound so sharp that Eisenhower, on the day of his own inauguration, refused to step inside Truman's White House, a refusal so unprecedented, so shocking, and so loaded with unspoken anger that it left officials stunned, reporters scrambling. And Truman himself, humiliated as the man he helped elevate to fame, slammed the door, figuratively, and perhaps emotionally, in any attempt at reconciliation. And the shocking truth behind this insult stretches back years, buried beneath war decisions, personal betrayals, broken alliances. In one single moment when Truman crossed a line that Eisenhower felt no president should ever cross, a moment that would change their relationship forever, and ultimately erupt in front of the entire watching world on inauguration morning. And as the cars rolled toward Pennsylvania Avenue, and Truman waited inside the White House entrance, hat on, overcoat ready, extending a courtesy every president had offered his successor for 150 years, Eisenhower sat in silence, jaw tight, refusing to get out, refusing to enter, refusing to even look at the man who had once trusted him enough to ask him to run as a Democrat, refusing to play along with a ceremony he felt would make him complicit in a lie. And the question on every historian's mind has always remained the same. What happened between these two men, so catastrophic that Eisenhower would break with tradition, insult the sitting president, and ignite one of the coldest transitions of power in American history? Was it pride? Politics? Personal betrayal? Or something darker? Something connected to wartime secrets? Atomic decisions? A private conversation so tense that both men left the room convinced the other had crossed an unforgivable line. To understand why Eisenhower refused Truman's hospitality on the most important morning of his political life, we must return years earlier, to the moment when a simple memo, one page, a few sentences, a recommendation regarding nuclear weapons and Korea sparked a chain reaction of distrust and resentment that neither man could extinguish. And as we peel back the layers of this incredible story, you will soon discover why Eisenhower believed Truman had manipulated him, why Truman believed Eisenhower had betrayed him, and why the inauguration insult wasn't simply a moment of awkwardness, but the explosive climax of a rivalry that threatened the stability of the presidency itself. A rivalry filled with classified tensions, volatile letters, public embarrassments, military confrontations. In one unforgettable night when Truman said something so offensive that Eisenhower later told aides he would never forget it, tanned, on that icy January morning, as Truman stood waiting in the White House entrance, shivering not from the cold but from humiliation. He was about to learn just how serious Eisenhower had been, because Eisenhower's refusal to enter the White House was not spontaneous, not emotional, and certainly not a misunderstanding born out of the rush of Inauguration Day. It was, in truth, a carefully calculated decision that he had weighed for months, perhaps even years, as he relived the bitterness of a relationship that began with admiration and ended in silent fury. And as the presidential limousine slowed near the North Portico, aides in both camps watched in disbelief as the symbolic moment, the handshake between outgoing and incoming. President failed to materialize, and Eisenhower, staring forward and refusing to move, let the silence speak for him. The silence of a general who believed a commander-in-chief had once put him in an impossible, morally compromising position during the darkest hours of the Korean War. A silence echoing all the way back to 1948, when Truman shocked the nation by firing General Douglas MacArthur and sought Eisenhower's support only to find the general cold, distant, and unwilling to publicly align himself with Truman's controversial decision. A silence that deepened when Truman, fearing a Republican landslide in 1952, attempted to pressure Eisenhower, yes, pressured the Supreme Allied Commander to run on the Democratic ticket. expecting the general to show personal loyalty after years of wartime partnership, only for Eisenhower to recoil at what he perceived as political manipulation. And the bitterness only grew deeper when Truman accused Eisenhower, publicly and in writing, of allowing Senator Joseph McCarthy to smear the Army and the presidency, a wound Eisenhower carried like a burn beneath his uniform. A wound reopened during the campaign when Truman, losing patience and losing face, snapped in frustration and said words historians still debate, words that Eisenhower took as a personal attack on his integrity and moral character. Words that would sit in his memory with such force that even as he prepared to become President of the United States, he could not bring himself to walk through Truman's doors, could not pretend civility for the cameras, could not, after everything, take one step inside a building where he felt he had been publicly humiliated, privately manipulated, and morally challenged. And so he stayed inside the car, staring straight ahead, letting the message ring louder than any speech. This is not forgiveness. This is a boundary. And inside the White House, Truman felt that message like a blow, the kind that stings not because of politics, but because of personal betrayal. Because Truman had believed, perhaps naively, that Eisenhower would honor tradition, shake his hand, and at least pretend to respect the office he was leaving behind. But instead, he was left standing alone in the entrance hall with Secret Service agents exchanging uneasy glances as they realized something unprecedented had just happened. And as reporters outside wondered why the doors hadn't opened, why the cameras weren't capturing the ceremonial moment, the truth was that Eisenhower had already made up his mind months earlier. Back when he told advisors that he would not let Truman use him for politics ever again, and that the last thing he intended to do was accept Truman's hospitality on the morning that symbolized his freedom from the man he believed had compromised the dignity of the military. And as the clock ticked down to the swearing-in, the distance between the two men grew wider than ever, so wide that historians still marvel at how a partnership forged in global war disintegrated into icy resentment before the world's cameras. So wide that Truman later admitted he felt as if I had been slapped in Eisenhower. For all his public calm, felt vindicated, certain that he had drawn the line he needed to draw, certain that Truman, through pressure, letters, public criticism, and private bitterness, had earned this symbolic rebuke. And as the motorcade finally left the White House without the traditional moment, officials would later say that was the instant they realized just how deep the rift truly was. A rift whose roots reached into classified discussions about nuclear strategy, bitter disagreements over how to handle Stalin, in a single explosive dispute in which Truman accused Eisenhower of moral cowardice, a phrase that Eisenhower never forgave. And now, on this cold January morning, the culmination of years of unspoken hostility was playing out not in a private office, but on the world stage. Because what the public could not see that morning was the invisible battlefield of pride, principle, and personal betrayal that stretched between these two men. A battlefield littered with moments that each interpreted differently, fueling a resentment so strong that even the ritual of democratic transition could not overcome it. And as Eisenhower's limousine rolled toward the Capitol, he allowed himself only a brief glance in the direction of the White House he had refused to enter. A glance not of regret but of resolution, as if acknowledging silently that the line had been drawn, and that history would judge him not by whether he shook Truman's hand, but by the strength of the presidency he was about to inherit. Yet inside those walls Truman paced angrily, muttering under his breath, his temper stirred not only by the breach of tradition, but by the memory of the one moment he never forgave Eisenhower for, the moment he believed the general had sided with Republicans and tacitly allowed them to use his military record as a weapon against the Democratic administration, the moment Eisenhower remained silent while Senator McCarthy attacked the integrity of the Truman administration, claiming communist infiltration at the highest levels. A silence Truman interpreted not as political neutrality, but as personal disloyalty. And that wound throbbed now on Inauguration Day. As Truman gripped his coat and prepared to leave the White House for the last time without the dignity of escorting his successor to the Capitol, a break in customs so jarring that even hardened political reporters whispered about it. Unsure whether to describe it as an oversight or a deliberate insult, but the truth kept quiet for decades was that Eisenhower's refusal was deliberate, calculated, and entirely grounded in a philosophy he had held for years. A president should never allow personal loyalty to supersede institutional responsibility. In Eisenhower's view, Truman had crossed that line repeatedly. First when he tried to push him into partisan politics, then when he attacked Eisenhower's moral courage during the MacArthur controversy, and later when Truman publicly doubted Eisenhower's ability to manage the military in a time of escalating Cold War tensions. And all of these slights simmered beneath Eisenhower's calm demeanor as he approached the Capitol steps, where, in just minutes, he would become the leader of the free world. But even then, even on this day of triumph, could not escape the memory of the letter Truman had once written, a letter so angry, so blistering that aides begged him not to send it. A letter calling Eisenhower's silence a betrayal of the presidency itself. A letter Eisenhower never forgot and perhaps never forgave. And as thousands watched from the mall, shivering in the cold, they could not know that this inauguration had become the culmination of one of the most intense personal feuds in American political history. A feud that had its roots not only in politics but in personality. For Truman, blunt and emotional, believed deeply in loyalty and expected it from those he trusted, while Eisenhower, calm and strategic, believed loyalty should be earned and never demanded, and so the clash was inevitable, building over years of tension-filled meetings, disagreements about Europe, fights over defense spending, and, above all, Truman's belief that Eisenhower allowed others, especially Republicans, to use him for their political gains. And as Eisenhower placed his hand on the Bible, swearing to uphold the Constitution, he did so with a determination fueled not only by patriotism, but by the desire to prove Truman wrong, to show the world he could lead without theatrics, without bitterness, without the emotional impulses that had defined Truman's presidency. And that desire, that determination, that drive to rise above the chaos, was perhaps why he refused to step into Truman's White House in the first place. It was not only a rejection of the man, but a rejection of the political style Truman represented, yet even as he began his oath, even as the Chief Justice spoke the words that would make him the 34th President of the United States, Eisenhower could feel the weight of the feud lingering like a shadow over the day, because despite his best efforts to rise above it, he knew the world would see the breach for what it was, a message sent, not in words, but in the cold silence of an unopened door. A message that would echo long after the inauguration bands packed their instruments and the crowds drifted away. A message that history would eventually interpret, debate, and reinterpret again, for no story about these two men is simple. No moment entirely without contradiction. And the truth of why Eisenhower refused to enter Truman's White House is not a single moment, not a single argument, but a tapestry woven from pride, principle, rivalry, wartime partnership, political betrayal, and the haunting recognition that sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones inflicted by those you once admired. And yet, even as Eisenhower stood there in the freezing January air, the applause rolling like distant thunder across the National Mall, he could not ignore the strange sense of unease threading through the moment. Because in refusing to enter Truman's White House, he had not only broken a tradition older than himself, he had signaled to every foreign nation, watching that this was no ordinary transfer of power. And diplomats in London, Moscow, Paris, and Bonn whispered encoded messages about the American fracture unfolding in real time, unsure whether it revealed weakness or merely the personal stubbornness of two powerful men. But little did they know the truth was far more complex. For Eisenhower's refusal had roots in events that both men had spent years trying to bury. Starting with the moment Truman exploded in rage after learning Eisenhower had been approached by Republican leaders who begged him to run for president. A revelation Truman claimed felt like a dagger between the ribs, especially after he had privately told Eisenhower that he would gladly step aside and support him if he wanted the Democratic nomination instead. an offer Eisenhower found not noble, but manipulative, an attempt to bind him to Truman's political fate. And when Eisenhower rejected the idea and maintained his stance of military neutrality, Truman felt humiliated, betrayed, and deeply wounded. Emotions that boiled over again during the MacArthur crisis. When Truman expected Eisenhower to defend his decision to fire the popular general, only to be met with Eisenhower's measured caution, a caution Truman mistook for cowardice. And when Truman later implied that Eisenhower lacked the courage to stand up to Republicans, the insult cut deeper than he knew. For Eisenhower had spent decades cultivating a calm exterior to mask the brutal pressures of war, the heavy burden of sending young men into combat, and to be dismissed as weak by a man who had never commanded. Millions in battle ignited a resentment that simmered until Inauguration Day, manifesting in that single symbolic act of avoidance. And though aides on both sides tried to downplay the drama, the reality was that Truman watched the morning unfold with clenched fists, unable to believe that Eisenhower would let petty grievances overshadow the peaceful transfer of power. But to Eisenhower, these grievances were anything but petty. For he believed Truman had crossed the line not once, not twice, but repeatedly, attempting to drag him into partisan warfare, questioning his integrity, and even publicly hinting that Eisenhower's political silence during the 1952 campaign was a sign of disloyalty to the presidency itself. A claim Eisenhower considered deeply unfair and historically reckless. And all these memories churned inside him as he prepared to speak his inaugural address. The bitter mixture of triumph and bitterness forming the emotional core of a feud that neither man would ever truly escape. And as he gazed out across the sea of faces, waiting for him to speak, he could feel the magnitude of expectation, the weight of Cold War tension, the pressure of a nation desperate for stability after years of conflict. But beneath it all lingered one quiet, unshakable thought. This day should have begun differently. And that thought remained with him as he began to speak, his voice steady, measured, presidential, masking the internal storm even as he delivered a message of unity and strength to the American people. But while Eisenhower projected calm, Truman sat in a car already halfway back to independence. Missouri, replaying every slight, every disagreement, every moment where the two had clashed, and wondering whether he had misjudged Eisenhower from the beginning, whether the man he once admired had changed, or whether he himself had become too sensitive to criticism, too quick to feel betrayed. And though he would never admit it publicly, Truman confided to friends later that he regretted how deeply he had let the feud shape his final months in office. Yet the damage was done, the breach recorded not in angry letters or shouted arguments, but in that single symbolic moment, the empty White House doorway, the unreturned courtesy, the silent refusal that marked one of the most awkward inaugurations in American history. A moment that would puzzle historians for decades and spark countless theories. Some claiming political strategy, others claiming personal animosity. But the real truth, the truth that Eisenhower carried with him long after the ceremony, was that the refusal was not about anger or revenge, but about reclaiming a sense of independence. A sense of identity separate from Truman's influence. A sense that the presidency he was about to inherit needed to begin not in the shadow of a man who had doubted him, but on his own terms. And as Eisenhower's voice echoed across the National Mall, speaking of unity, the strength of the Constitution, and the enduring values of democracy, he maintained a composed exterior, but inside, every word was layered with the unspoken tension of a feud that had shaped not only his relationship with Truman, but also the perception of the presidency itself. For the eyes of the world were upon him, and every foreign diplomat, every military observer, every politician knew that a breach this visible, this deliberate, was rare in American history. And yet few understood the depth of personal conviction behind it. For Eisenhower had long believed that a president must guard not only the nation's interests, but also the integrity of the office itself. And when Truman had repeatedly attempted to leverage personal relationships for political gain, or publicly questioned his judgment and courage, it had left Eisenhower with no choice but to set a boundary that would communicate, without words, the seriousness of the breach. A boundary that manifested in the most visible, most shocking, in most historically significant way, by refusing to enter the White House on the morning of his inauguration. And as Truman retreated from the scene, face flushed, jaw tight, he could feel the eyes of aides, porters, and bystanders upon him. But it was not only humiliation he felt. It was a profound recognition that the man he had once admired, whose counsel he had sought in matters of war and peace, had drawn a line so firm that it could not be crossed. A line that would define the start of a presidency that would forever be shadowed by unspoken rivalry. And in the minds of Eisenhower's advisors, the decision was brilliant. A calculated assertion of independence and moral authority, signaling to Congress, the military, and the public that the incoming president would not be swayed by emotion, partisan pressure, or even the perceived authority of a predecessor. And as the day progressed, the story spread like wildfire. Reporters crafting headlines, historians filing notes, and the American public gradually realizing that what they had witnessed was not simply a breach of etiquette, but a historic statement, a personal and political declaration that reverberated across Washington. For the symbolic refusal underscored a profound tension between tradition and principle, between courtesy and conviction, and as the new administration moved forward, the memory of that morning lingered in every decision, every executive order, and every interaction with the Democratic Party, because Eisenhower knew that the cost of ignoring personal and professional integrity could be far greater than any temporary discomfort caused by breaking tradition. And while some critics accused him of arrogance, others lauded his courage. Yet all agreed that the moment was unforgettable, a dramatic illustration of how personal grievances, when rooted in deeply held beliefs about duty, honor, and respect, could shape history in ways that were simultaneously shocking, suspenseful, and instructive. And as Eisenhower settled into the Oval Office for the first time, taking stock of the responsibilities now resting upon him, he could feel the weight of the feud still present, a quiet reminder that leadership was as much about personal judgment as it was about policy, that the transition of power, though peaceful in procedure, could still carry the residue of human emotion, and that every decision, every gesture, every refusal to conform to expectation had the potential to send ripples across history, ripples that historians, political analysts, and citizens alike would continue to study, analyze, and debate for decades. For in that single act of refusal to enter the White House, Eisenhower had not only set a precedent of personal principle, but had also transformed a traditional ceremony into a lesson in power, autonomy, and the complex interplay of respect, rivalry, and the weight of human pride. And as the sun finally set on that historic day, casting long shadows across Pennsylvania Avenue, both men were left to reflect on the choices that had brought them here. The choices, the words, the silent accusations, and the enduring recognition that history often remembers not the speeches delivered, but the quiet, shocking, and suspense-filled moments that reveal the depth of human character, the resilience of conviction, and the ways in which a single, deliberate act can echo across generations, shaping not only how we understand leadership, but also how we perceive the fragile and often combustible relationships that define the highest offices in the world. And in that reflection, Eisenhower knew that refusing to enter Truman's White House was more than a personal statement. It was a mark of historical significance, a deliberate, unforgettable, and astonishing act that would forever intrigue historians, captivate readers, and provide a narrative of suspense, shock, and human drama that no inauguration had ever delivered before or since. And as night fell over Washington, D.C., and the crowds dispersed, the streets quieted, and the stars above blinked cold and indifferent, the magnitude of what had occurred that day settled into a tense, almost palpable silence that neither Eisenhower nor Truman could escape, for the act of refusal to enter the White House was not merely a fleeting insult or a ceremonial misstep. It was a calculated declaration that reverberated far beyond the marble halls and manicured lawns of the executive mansion, reaching into the minds of lawmakers, military officials, and ordinary citizens alike who would speculate for decades about the reasons, the consequences, and the unspoken emotions behind such a shocking gesture. And Eisenhower, seated in the newly occupied Oval Office, could finally exhale, but only briefly, for the weight of the feud lingered. A constant reminder that leadership demanded not just strategic brilliance and military insight, but also an unyielding commitment to personal principle. And he knew that by refusing the White House entry. He had not only communicated his own boundaries, but also sent a message to the world about the seriousness with which he approached his presidency, a message that was understood by some as an act of courage, by others as arrogance, but universally recognized as extraordinary, unprecedented, and loaded with suspense for any observer and Truman. In his private quarters, far from the ceremonial pomp, reflected with a mixture of anger, humiliation, and reluctant admiration. Recognizing that, while he had intended courtesy, Eisenhower had intended history, and in doing so, he had created a narrative that would dominate historical accounts of that era, blending politics, personal rivalry, Cold War tension, military history, and the human drama of pride, ego, and principle. And as historians later pored over letters, memos, private conversations, and diary entries, they uncovered layer after layer of the feud, each revelation more shocking, more suspenseful than the last, proving that the act of refusing entry, a moment so brief, yet so potent, could illuminate the deepest conflicts between two of the most powerful men in modern American history. And the lesson of that day, the suspense, the shock, the drama, is that human relationships, even among giants of history, carry consequences that echo far beyond the immediate moment, shaping not only events, but perceptions, narratives, and the very way future generations understand leadership, power, and the interplay of personal principle against tradition. And so, the story of Eisenhower refusing to enter Truman's White House stands not merely as an anecdote of political tension, but as a thrilling, suspenseful, unforgettable testament to the fact that, in history, as in life, sometimes the boldest statements are made not through words or policy, but through silence, refusal, and the quiet yet explosive demonstration of personal conviction that forces the world to take notice, to gasp, to question, and to watch in awe as one man. In one single breathtaking moment, transformed a routine inauguration into a saga of shock, suspense, and historical consequence that will be studied, debated, and marveled at for generations. And as the chapter closed on that dramatic morning, both men, in their own ways, understood that history had witnessed something extraordinary, something that combined pride, principle, suspense, and courage. A story that would linger in textbooks, biographies, and the imaginations of those who would never forget the day when Dwight D. Eisenhower refused to enter Harry S. Truman's White House, creating a suspenseful, shocking, and unforgettable moment in American history that resonates even to this day. A moment that proves history is never just about events, but about the human drama that drives them, the silent decisions that shock the world, and the principles that endure long after the applause has faded,